Good afternoon. Today I'm going to cover a murder that happened many years ago on at 11:48 p.m. approximately in December 11th, 1881. This lady took her abusive husband to the promised land. Now, he was really a bad man, not a good man, but the crime was really just horrible. And her fate was worse. Stay tuned. It's a good story. Now, this is 1881, when women had little to no rights. And this lady and her two children and their cousin were put to horrible, horrible things. The neighbors, the children, even the dogs thought that their life was horrible. From his boyhood, he was very aggressive, generally concealed that the murder was not accompanied by anybody that didn't deserve it. He was a bad man. He was seen to be half deaf. He had a mania for reading newspapers from beginning to end. He'd walk for miles, and he was called Shiftless Bill. He led his family in the most miserable life, and they were quick from the neighbors to have anything to do with them. Several days elapsed before the acts of the mutilation had been committed was found. Now, this was identified as his acts because he liked to chase his wife around the room with her. And he just was a horrible person. And Mrs. Druse just had to protect herself. But on the day of the murder, she went a little far. When I say a little far, she went over the hill. Her husband was sitting down to breakfast, and the two children were in the room. But he was in no mood to be reasonable. He had the axe next to him, and he was being his normal, lousy self, abusing his children and arguing with his wife. Roxy sent them out of the house to protect them, and he proceeded to do things like continue yelling, abusing. She got to the point where she went to the pantry and got her gun. Now, at this point, I can certainly understand she was in a lot of trouble. This man was known for for abuse. She knew it. She'd been married to him for 20 years. But she shot him once. Now, this one shot nicked him in the neck. She wasn't a good shot, and it made him mad. Now, you're talking about a hurt abuser, and you're talking big-time trouble. At this point, her nephew came in, whether on his own, whether he had heard what was happening, nobody will ever know for sure. But he came in, and he shot the man 3 to 4 times. Now, he's still alive. And he's yelling, no, don't do this. He's still alive. He's been shot 4 or 5 times. And she panics. This is at the point where she no longer gets my sympathy. She picks up his axe. And while the man is yelling, don't, she hits him in the head with it. This does not cause his death. So she hacks his head off. Now, this means that the man was alive when his head was cut off. if that was the worst of it, probably I would still be somewhat in her sympathy. Adrenaline is running. She's been abused for 20 years. But they didn't know what to do. So they took the head out to a fire and lit it, and then cut the body into little pieces and cooked him in the stove. Now, she was found guilty, but now we're going to touch on what she confessed to her doctor the day before she was actually executed. These are her own words. At around 9 o'clock in the morning, she called Dr. Powell and said she wanted to see him. Now, she was due to be hung the next day, and she said, "What I'm about to say to you has never been made public before, and I assure you on the honor of a woman standing on the brink of the grave that I am speaking the truth. The world is turned against me, but I know I have one friend, and that is you." Now, she's speaking to the doctor. "You must promise me that you will not say a word until I am gone. Then you can publish it and let the world know the truth. I don't want to take any more of your time than I can help, so I will begin. I must take you back to the morning of the murder and tell of a conversation that I had with Charles Gates in reference to the killing of Druse. Is it about December 1st, Wednesday night? He was away, as he usually was at this time. It was normal for him to be gone for some time. And Frank was riding downhill, and Mary was upstairs. He asked me if I did not want to get rid of Druse. I told him I was nearly dead and that I did not care what happened. He asked me if I had a pistol that he gave me, and it was in the pantry, as I told him. I went and got it, showed it to him, and he said it wasn't loaded in all the barrels, so he loaded it up for me. He wanted to know if I knew how to fire it, and I went to the door and snapped it. It did not go off, as it put it in another cartridge and said, "Well, you know how to do it, and that's enough. Now, if anything happened, you can depend on me to help you." Excuse me. Now, the night after, on the 17th, he told me not to hurry up and take the first chance I got. He said I should not turn the head, and said that he would take care of anything like that. He said he would get to the buckwheat at the same time and save any cause of suspicion. That next morning, I saw him coming up the road just as Drew sat down at breakfast. That was just after he had raised an axe to strike me, and I ran to the pantry. I got the pistol and came out. He was sitting down at the table. He swore awful about the sugar and the tea, and I raised the pistol and shot. I hit him in the neck and only stunned him. Gates then shot through the window, and he fell to the floor. Gates then shot again. I only shot once, and Gates threw 3 or 4 more times. I took the axe and cut the head off and chopped him up. The head was wrapped up in paper and carried out to the woodshed. It was put in a load of buckwheat. The boxley was all burned up, and none was given to the pigs. That fact that somebody said is not true. It was all boiled and then burned. Gates came that night, and I told him what had happened. He grasped my hand and said, "I had done nobly." He said we'd come back for the buckwheat tomorrow morning, which he did. He drew his head and took it with him. It was buried 1 mile in Richfield Springs, where I could find it if I wished. Charles Pete overheard us talking about it once, but he is dead now and can't talk. Gates is the only other one that knows anything about it. There was another man that he got into the buckwheat, and that was Elwood. His name was Bill. It took 8 hours to burn the body, and it made an awful smell. I nearly fainted several times. Mary and Frank were there some of the time, but they did not see much. I sent them down to the woods to carry singles. I killed Druse because I could not stand it any longer. He was a brute, and I had not slept with him in 12 years. That's all I can tell you. Gates put up Frank to tell you what to shove it to all into me. But he will put his report, he will get his own reward. Now, if you must not tell any of this until I am gone, and do not let it be done until after 12 o'clock tomorrow. I don't care how many know about it by then. I trust in you to do it all right. So, she basically said that really it was this other man that did the murder, but she said she would go to the hanging, and she did. Now, with the hanging. Now, there'd only been a few women hung before her, and she was the last one to be hung. Now, not only had this system allowed this woman to be abused for 20 years, put up with the children being abused for 20 years, she was forced to die for a crime that she was no more guilty of than another man. And the night before, she slept very little. She didn't go to bed until midnight, and she didn't sleep at all, hardly. She would get up and walk around and do some writing. She wrote letters to friends and appeared to be somewhat relieved of that occupation. Some flowers and an accompanying letter from her daughter, Mary, who was confined to the Syracuse Penitentiary for life and was brought to her last night. And she wrote a touching note to her daughter in reply. Her bearing, however, as whole, was resolute, and his resignation was very clear. She appeared to fear her approaching death, but at times during the night, the watchers thought it was that an unfortunate woman had found relief in sleep. They were generally mistaken because as the night wore on, in the break of day, in some effort to obtain a little rest, at last finding it was impossible to sleep, she rose, bathed her face, and began making preparations. Now, the preparations had been completely done, and everything possible had been done to make a successful thing of it. There were a few persons in town when the day broke, but as the day went on, the crowds came. After dressing herself in a most careful manner, putting on a black cashmere dress, and she sat down at breakfast, but could not eat any of the food. She was joined by Reverend Dr. Powell, her spiritual advisor, and prayed with him. At about 11:15, the jurors and the spectators were brought in to see what was going on, and the death warrant was read by the sheriff, and the legal advice was then given down, and they took her pulse, which was beating at 80 beats a minute. She then broke down almost completely, and it was feared that they were going to have to carry her to the gallows. She, however, did get some emotional support from Dr. Powell and recovered composure and walked the scaffold. Sheriff Cook led the way, followed by her, and she was leaning heavily on the Reverend's arm. It was greatly flushed, but no tears were shed. When she reached the fatal spot, she stepped into the middle of the board platform, building up around the ground, and knelt with Dr. Powell up in prayer, lasting about 3 minutes. Happening to cast her eyes forward, she caught sight of the dangling noose, which she had not noticed before, and had a convulsive tremor shook. She was a very slight woman, and she sobbed greatly. At the end of the prayer, both of her and the doctor grasped her hand, bade her goodbye, and stepped outside of the enclosure. She whispered to the Reverend to thank her friends that had labored so long to try to save her life. She then gave the nod to her doctor, and the executioner stepped forward and positioned her arms. The noose was adjusted, and the black cap drawn down around her face. At this point, she showed signs of collapse and began to shriek and scream at the top of her lungs in hysterical measure. But the drop of the 215-pound weight choked her, and she could no longer cry. The body was awful. The crime would shock the entire country, and things were signed up. She flailed around for as long as 15 minutes. After the lapse of 1 minute, the clenching of the fists concurred, followed efforts to draw up her legs. Pulse also began to beat very rapidly, around 102, and although she was very feeble, that went up to 140, although slightly weak. 2 minutes later, is at 120. The heartbeat at this point was 45 per minute. The pulse continued to get slower until 15 minutes after the drop fell. The pronounced extinct of her body. The drop fell at 11:48 and was pronounced dead or extinct and lowered to the stretcher. The neat invitation was taken, and they took off the black cap where you could clearly see the cuts of the throat and the face and the discoloration and the noose that had cut a bunch of flowers and some lace that she had worn on her neck, and had forced them to be embedded in the flesh. It was put into a coffin and turned away, so it'd probably take the remnants of the receiving vault at Oak Hill Cemetery, lock them up until it would determine what final disposition to do them. And as a result of the horrors, they never hung anyone else in New York.